All right, hello everybody. This is A.W. Antonio Wolf. Doing some reading with some friends. Paul W. Frank's All or Nothing, Systematicity, Transcendental Arguments, and Skepticism in German Idealism. A really good text, in my opinion. I've only read about a fourth of the entire book, I think. And that was something like 4 years ago. But what I did read was very good. It's more like a primer on the history of philosophy before German idealism. And of course, there's always interpretive problems. Everybody has their interpretation, so, it's not like, this is not a substitute for reading Kant and reading Leibniz and reading Wolff and all those other people. By the way, I was surprised that you said Wolff was very good. Not that I thought Wolff was bad, Pedro, but I just hadn't known. I didn't know anybody who had read Wolff besides Zorn. And Zorn said Wolff was very interesting.
That's very, very nice, man. It's very nice.
So that certainly gets me to think that I ought to read Wolff, just like how I ought to get around to read Leibniz, because Leibniz is also very interesting, despite how, unfortunately, there's not much in English.
Wolff's system of science is very interesting and made a lot of things clearer to me when I read it, And I think that most that goes by his name is a plain and simple caricature. The man was fucking sharp.
Oh yeah, I don't doubt it. Zorn surprised me when he said that people don't understand that the categories that Hegel tends... Almost all the categories in the science of logic are Wolffian categories. It's interesting that, nobody asks the question. Well, most people, certainly, and even in academia, you don't notice in secondary literature. Nobody asks, why did Hegel choose the categories that he did?
Yeah. What caught my attention in Wolff was his systematicity, really, that kind of trying to departing from first principles and going even to treat anthropology and stuff like that, things that usually are not considered to be philosophical themes in themselves within a more broad system,
Yeah, would you say that he's basically what Spinoza was to Descartes, but for Leibniz, where he's the one who takes Leibniz to the logical conclusion?
I don't know Leibniz enough to say that.
Yeah, because I know that Wolff considered himself just a follower of Leibniz, but then he just kind of expanded on it.
What I found interesting too was some methodological principles that I don't remember right now, but that made a huge impression on me at that time. Like basic stuff, like for example, the critique of... There is a certain critique of formalism in him, and on how you can actually play with logic and get to absurd conclusions departing from any premise whatsoever. So there is a problem with the content over there, I don't know. It's been a while. I think I'm going to download his book again.
Yeah, I should read it, because as Voltaire did Leibniz dirty with Candide. Yes, he did. I never had to read Candide in any philosophy class, but I actually took a humanities class where we were supposed to read Candide, and I did not read Candide, because that was during a depressive spell of mine, and I didn't go to class for like 2 weeks. And when I returned, they're like, "Oh, you were supposed to read this thing," and I'm like, So I sat in with a group, and I just completely bullshit myself through that session. Because it was also a group exam, and I just completely BS'd myself through it, and I got an A. And the teacher's like, "You didn't read this, did you?" And I'm like, "Nope." But
Ever.
But she's like, "Well, you're really good at coming up with things really quickly." Anyways,
Okay,
we can get
let's
on.
go.
We can get on with this. Chapter 1: Kantian dualism. Quote, "Not to mention the task that touches the interest of philosophy most nearly at the present moment. To put God back again at the peak of philosophy, absolutely prior to all else as the one and only ground of everything, the unique, principium essendi and cognoscendi, after all this time in which he has been put beside other finite things, or put off right to the end as a postulate that springs from absolute finitude. Quote from Hegel's. I assume that's from some German compilations, collected works. Quote, how it could happen that a whole epoch of philosophers, from Reinhold to Hegel, was of the opinion that philosophy must be deduced from a single proposition, this has still remained unclear to me, and I have as yet found no answer for it in the literature. Unquote, by Rutgers, cited by Amarix. I don't know either of these two authors. Another quote, to be sure, it seems odd that we can determine our concepts of things in themselves appropriately only insofar as we first lead back all reality to the concept of God, and that we should apply it to other things as things in themselves only insofar as it finds its place within that concept. That alone is properly the means of separation of everything sensible and of appearance from that which can be considered through the understanding as appropriate to things in themselves. Quote by Kant. I assume from the Critique of Pure Reason. Certainly must be said, I think part of what this book does is it makes a case for Kant, and the author, Paul W. Franks, admits that his reading of Kant is not what he thinks Kant himself was saying, but he tries to make a reading of Kant here in this chapter of what he thinks is the best case scenario of an interpretation for what the German idealists understood Kant to be saying. Anyways, 1.1. What is German idealism? It is not, I suggest, a philosophical position, but rather a family of philosophical programs. What then do members of this family have in common? What are the topics about which, like members of every family, they tend to argue? In the first place, the German idealist programs share a common origin in Kant's critical philosophy. More specifically, German idealists are post-Kantians. They seek to complete the revolution begun by Kant, which they believe requires them to go beyond Kant himself. For the time being, the following will suffice as an expression of Kant's revolutionary insight. The truth of the claims to knowledge classified by Kant as synthetic a priori. Knowledge of mathematics and of metaphysics, including the foundations of physics, does not consist, as has been assumed hitherto, in conformity to things as they are in themselves, independently of the human mind. It consists rather in conformity to the a priori conditions of human knowledge, which constitute the objects of human knowledge, objects that are thus mind-dependent. Just as Copernicus proposes that the motions we observe every day are not absolute motions independent of us, as has always been assumed, but are rather motions relative to our own standpoint, so Kant proposes that the objects with which we interact every day are objects relative to our own standpoint. Any Kantian or post-Kantian should agree to this form of words, but like Copernicus' astronomical revolution, it is open to many interpretations. Kant's understanding of his revolution will be the theme of this chapter and the next. The German idealist understanding of the Kantian revolution will be the implicit theme of this entire book, to which I will return explicitly in the final chapter. To go beyond Kant is, at some point, to part company with Kant. Where, then, is the parting of the ways? It is often said that Kant is a dualist, whereas German idealists are monists. But as it stands, this is nothing but a slogan. First, there are many different senses of dualism and monism, not all of which conflict. Second, without an understanding of the complex of problems to which it responds, a philosophical doctrine is a dead letter. To determine where Kantians and German idealists accompany one another and where they part ways, it is necessary to determine the complex of problems to which each responds and to examine the relationship between the two complexes. The topic of this chapter will be the overlap between the problems confronting Kant and the problems confronting German idealists. As we shall see, this is a delicate matter. There is an overlap, but even a slight shift in one direction or another is sufficient for the overlap to all but vanish. Some complications must be acknowledged in advance. First, it will not be helpful to begin with what the German idealists themselves say about Kant, or with what Kant himself says about them, for they interpret Kant's revolution in the wake of another major philosophical event, the Spinozism controversy initiated by Jacobi. Consequently, much of what the German idealists say directly about Kant would be rightly rejected by contemporary Kant interpreters. Meanwhile, Kant's understanding of what came to be known as German idealism is mainly second-hand, derived from the letters and reviews of some of his followers who are hostile to the new developments. It is on the basis of this unsympathetic interpretation that Kant publicly repudiates German idealism in 1799 after 10 years in which it has appeared to have his support. Thus, my topic in this chapter will not be the ways in which either Kant or the German idealists understand their commonality, for their understandings are too partisan to serve as a starting point for charitable assessment. Only in the second chapter will I begin to thematize the differences between the Kantian and German idealist problematics, attending to the transformative effect of the Spinozism controversy on German idealist readings of Kant. At this point, a second complication arises. For Kant is a moving target. Far from being static, his thoughts continue to develop and transform even after the revolution marked by the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. To be sure, this is also true of each German idealist, but Kant's development is especially pertinent to the assessment of the relationship between Kantianism and German idealism. For a certain picture of his development can be suggested when Kantians accuse German idealists, as they often do, of regressing to a pre-critical position, hence of undoing the very revolution they intend to complete. Kant's own letter of repudiation may be read in this way. But while there is certainly something to the distinction between critical and pre-critical philosophy, what there is to that distinction should be no more clear than what the Kantian revolution amounts to. And that is exactly the bone of contention. In particular, it should not be assumed that the emergence within German idealism of some element of Kant's pre-1781 philosophy is a symptom that the revolution is coming undone. In fact, as I will show in this chapter, elements of Kant's pre-1781 philosophy re-emerge within the development of Kant's own post-1781 thinking, and it is an open question whether such elements should be discarded or preserved in some revolutionized form. Indeed, as I will show in the next chapter, Kant's assessment of the adequacy of the transcendental idealism he is developing requires him to continue asking himself what he would now think if he were still pursuing his pre-critical project. Only then can he be sure that his philosophy is preferable to the best possible version of the transcendental realism that is its rival.
What do you think he meant by transcendental realism here?
Spinoza. Specifically Spinoza. Actually, this is where I learned this. I think either later in this chapter or in the second chapter, he comes to mention that in the first version of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant shits on Spinoza, like Spinoza is like a nobody, that he's an idiot, and it's so obvious that he's wrong. And then I think it's something like 7 years between the first, or in the years between the first edition and the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant goes ahead and, quote, rereads Spinoza. But this time he does it seriously. And then the second edition, he is way more charitable to Spinoza, to the point where he says that the only options for philosophy at his point in time are now either his philosophy, transcendental idealism, or Spinozism, which is transcendental realism.
Yeah.
So continuing. Yet a third complication should be acknowledged. Contemporary interpretations of Kant and German idealism tend, understandably enough, to be motivated by the problems that press contemporary philosophy. Many discussions assume without argument that a desirable philosophical position should be non-metaphysical. certainly in the sense of eschewing ontological commitment to any supernatural entity, and perhaps in the additional sense of eschewing any ontological commitment whatsoever, restricting itself to the exploration of our conceptual scheme. The warrant for this assumption is presumably that it would be uncharitable to ascribe a position that contemporary naturalist philosophers would reject out of hand to a philosopher with whom one sympathizes. Thus one finds that those who sympathize with Kant seek either to isolate a non-metaphysical strand within his philosophy, or else to interpret his philosophy in its entirety as non-metaphysical, whereas those who sympathize with German idealism tend to interpret Kant's philosophy as containing a metaphysical residue that is best eliminated by the endorsement of German idealism, interpreted as non-metaphysical. However, I do not wish to assume that the problems pressing contemporary naturalists are the problems confronting either Kant or the German idealists. In what follows, I will not avoid questions about whether Kant and the German idealists turn out, in some sense, to be metaphysicians. I will consider these questions in some detail in the conclusions to this book, but I will begin from the problems that I take to motivate them. Although these may not lie at the heart of contemporary concerns, I will do my best to relate them to, and also to distinguish them from, contemporary analogues. By the way, that whole conceptual scheme thing, that's Donald Davidson. And I listened to a lecture by Donald Davidson. Well, not a lecture, but an interview with another philosopher, McDowell. McDowell was interviewing Donald Davidson. And I've heard about the conceptual scheme argument. But that interview soured me on Donald Davidson insofar as, god damn, he's boring. Just like McDowell, I listened to a lecture by McDowell. God, McDowell is so boring. Like the way these people view philosophy is so boring. It is just propositions, propositional attitudes. I mean, talk about
philosophy at its best, right?
Yeah. I mean,
I find it funny because if you are not willing to accept that the transcendental subject is not natural, is not within the world, you are going to get Kant into some form of psychologism, you know what I mean? And that's a problem, because psychologism is actually self-contradictory. You are claiming that we think this or that is the case because of our psychological conditions, which will in the end be explained by some evolutionary argument bullshit. But then you are using the same tool that you are trying to describe, right? In a sense. Husserl have some very interesting arguments against psychologism in the first part of his logical investigations, you know. But in the moment that you deny the metaphysical aspect of transcendental subject, you are actually getting into the psychologism, and you are getting to this kind of naturalism, which says that we do math as we do because nature, because evolution, and that's it. The unfelt argument, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, psychologism is pretty stupid. Nonetheless, it persists. Let's continue.
Yeah, it's an easy answer. Please do.
Yeah, 1.2. German idealists seek to complete Kant's revolution through a program of systematization. They are committed to derivation monism, the view that in an adequate philosophical system, the a priori conditions of experience must somehow be derived from a single absolute first principle. Such a program is often said to be incompatible with Kant's own understanding of his revolution, specifically with the dualism said to be fundamental to his critical philosophy. But I am going to argue that derivation monism and the core of Kantian dualism are responses to a shared set of problems, and that under an important restriction, derivation monism is compatible with Kantian dualism and is even suggested at a certain stage of his development after 1781 by Kant himself. To understand the problems to which both Kantian dualism and German idealist derivation monism are responses, it is helpful to begin with a set of issues that is at once both ancient and contemporary. The issues raised by Agrippan skepticism. Suppose you are asked to respond to a why question. For any answer you give, the Agrippan skeptic undertakes to show that it is either a brute assertion that itself lacks justification, or a justification that raises a further why question, or a justification that presupposes what it is supposed to establish. If this can be done, then any response you give to the why question will either terminate arbitrarily, or lead to an infinite regress, or move in a circle. Collectively, these three alternatives constitute what is known as the Agrippan trilemma. Here are three possible responses to the trilemma. 1. You have failed to answer the question until you manage to answer the why question in a way that falls into none of the three options. Unless that happens, there is no reason to assume that you have given any justification whatsoever, and indeed there is no reason to assume that any justification whatsoever is available. 2. In at least some cases, there must be an answer to the question that falls into none of the three options, even if you have not yet succeeded in giving it. For if there is no reason to assume that justifications are sometimes available, then there is no reason for anything. 3. Even if you answer the question in a way that falls into one of the three options, your answer may still be satisfying. The two previous responses assume that no adequate justification can be, without further reason, infinitely regressive or circular. But this assumption is mistaken. The fact that some line of response to a why question is vulnerable to the Agrippan trilemma does not mean that it is an inadequate line of response, and it provides no ground for skepticism. I would wager that number 3 is bullshit.
Completely, man. Completely. No, not a single reason was given in this third reason, right?
Yep. The fact that people think that the popular one nowadays is brute facts. They're like it's just a brute fact.
Brute fact, yeah, right. Non-conceptualized facts, right?
Yep.
I think McDowell has a very interesting take on that. I think he has made a fairly interesting and actualized point on that when he says that, how can you explain something which is non-conceptual being able to ground reasons, right? Ground concepts. It's the old idea that, the analytical idea that there is this domain of non-conceptual facts that would actually be able to ground inferences and reasons, right?
Yeah. Which, by the way, the lecture that I watched, the interview. It was also a lecture by McDowell. Apparently, he's changed his mind a little bit from like the one work he's famous for, which is like Mind and World. And he says that the change he's had is that he's no longer entirely against the given. He allows for a certain kind of given, which he thinks does not fall into Cellar's myth of the given. And he thinks that kind of given is the kind of everyday givenness, where like I see a chair and like somehow like I immediately see a chair, I intuit it, and I'm not thinking about the concept of a chair or whatever, but I know it's a chair, and this justifies me saying a chair is in front of me. And
okay, but this is okay, yeah, we all accept that given, right?
Yeah, and so he's like,
philosophical argumentation to accept that the chair is a chair. We are practical beings. We are not going to wait for fucking Hegel to act upon the world. We accept things as givens in our daily basis, but that's not the point. What about the construction of institutions, right? What about the concept of justice that What about the critique of the social give and stuff like that? That's not the point. It reminds me of that guy who said, "Here's a hand." Here's a hand. Okay, thank you. So fuck off. Why are you giving philosophy lectures, man?
Yeah, I know you're talking about it. Can't remember the name right now. But yeah, I hate that argument. It's so stupid.
Here's my ass.
Basically, it's like, oh yeah, well, if skepticism is wrong, how come you don't like me shitting on your hands? It's not real, bro. It's not real. Anyways, continue. The Agrippan trilemma is often discussed as if it were an exclusively epistemological topic. Thus, foundationalist epistemologies are cited as examples of the second response, and coherentist epistemologies are as examples of the third. But in fact, the trilemma can arise whenever what is at stake is the nature of reasons, which need not only the reasons why someone believes something, but may also be the reasons why someone should do something, or reasons why something is the something it is. When I want to be neutral between epistemic, practical, and ontic reasons, I will speak of grounds. Let us say then that the first and second responses agree that a genuine grounding must terminate in an absolute ground. However, while the first response sees the failure to produce an absolute ground as motivating one to doubt, the second response sees that failure as a challenge that must, in some cases, be capable of being met. Meanwhile, the third response rejects the view that genuine grounding must terminate in an absolute ground. On this view, genuine groundings may be ungrounded, or infinitely regressive, or circular, or some subset of the above. Both derivation monism and Kantian dualism are fundamentally responses to a problem thematized by Leibniz, who made it central to 18th century German philosophy. The problem arises from the combination of two demands. First, there is the monistic demand. This is the demand that every genuine grounding participate in a single systematic unity of grounds, terminating in a single absolute ground. This is an expression of the second response to the Agrippan trilemma. Second, there is the dualistic demand that physical grounding and metaphysical grounding be kept rigorously separate. What motivates this demand is the thought that the evident promise of modern physical explanation that depends on the assumption of necessary physical laws governing all natural phenomena. This assumption entails the explanatory closure of physics. Physical phenomena are not to be explained in terms of non-physical factors, causes that are not bound by physical laws.
I don't know what is his background, Paul's background, but the problem of the regression to infinity and the problem of finding like a principle where which to begin to depart from is not something that can actually be considered to be exclusive of German idealism. Every fucking good philosophy that has ever written had this ambition, man. Like Aristotle had this ambition, right? Plato, with his idea of the good as being that from which everything emanates, is such an ambition too, you know. So I don't know. I'm not understanding why is he making this point that this is this worry is exclusive to German idealists. But let's see. Maybe I'm going too fast here.
Yeah, from what I remember, he doesn't go on to explain that this is unique. I mean, compared to, say, analytic philosophy or continental philosophy, it's certainly unique to German idealism, because no one else has it.
Yeah, but you see, analytical philosophy, if you take any, like, good book, systematic book on analytical philosophy that is grounding, I mean, that is dealing with fundamentals, they also have their own way of trying to ground all logical inferences on a basic primitive experience, or do you remember that idea of atomic sentences or anything like that? They too have this idea of derivational empiricism, you know. But let's see.
Yeah. I think there's a unifying demand. I don't know if there's a monistic demand. Like if a monistic, the monistic demand is that one principle should explain everything else. A unifying demand is more like you can use one certain thing to make sense of everything else. But that one certain thing is not necessarily going to be the explanatory ground of everything else. Like you can have, say, Hume. Hume's epistemology. And Hume will say, well, I can make sense of the world with my epistemology. But Hume won't say that his epistemology grounds ontology or grounds ethics.
Yeah. That's true. There is no ground for ethics in Hume.
Yeah, so I think there's certainly a distinction there.
Yeah, you're right.
Let's see, so first demand is the monistic demand.
The dualistic demand.
Yeah, and then the second demand is the dualistic demand. And the dualistic demand is just the view that every domain should have its own explanation, explanatory closure as the domain that it is, for the kinds of things that it is. So all physical things will obviously be explained physically. All chemical things will be explained chemically. All biological things will be explained biologically.
Yeah. It's like Schelling option over here when he says that there will always be two sciences, natural sciences, and that in which you depart from the object and try to explain that subject, and the transcendental idealism in which you depart from the subject and try somehow to explain objectivity, right?
I would say that's something similar. Yeah, I would say that's something similar, not exact, but very similar.
There is this idea of trying to. I think what Schelling is different from this is that Schelling is not trying to keep them apart. So, like physics will try to explain psychology, and society, and spirit, and transcendental idealism will try to explain the object. But both have in their inverse their true problematics. Like Fichte begins saying, well, our problem is to explain how can there be a succession or a chain of events that seems to not be immediately derivable from our will, right? But anyway, there is a difference. Dualism would, like straight dualism would say, you cannot do that. Please leave physical to the physics, and please leave mental to mind sciences or human sciences or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay, continuing. The two demands can be seen to be in apparent conflict once the following observation, which may be justified in a variety of ways, is added. Physical explanations do not, and indeed cannot, terminate in an absolute ground. Physical laws and the fundamental properties of matter they articulate are not plausible candidates for absoluteness. This observation entails that physical grounding, considered on its own, is vulnerable to the Agrippan trilemma. In contrast, metaphysical grounding may be conceived as escaping, in the Leibnizian tradition, is conceived in order to escape the Agrippan trilemma. Thus, properties are grounded in substances, conceived as property bearers that are not themselves born by anything else, and substances are in turn grounded in God, who is their absolute ground. The monistic demand would seem then to amount to a demand that physical phenomena be grounded in metaphysical substances and ultimately in God. However, neither metaphysical substances nor God may be introduced as the grounds of physical phenomena, for this would contradict the closure of physical explanation, hence the dualistic demand. The problem, then, is to find a way to satisfy both demands simultaneously. How can explanations that cannot themselves terminate in an absolute ground nevertheless be genuine groundings, on the assumption that genuine groundings must terminate in an absolute ground? How can physics be kept rigorously separate from metaphysics while being grounded in it? Leibniz's response to this problem is what I will call derivability monism, the explanatory conditions to which modern physics appeals, namely the primary properties of matter, must be in principle derivable from a set of metaphysical conditions, namely the intrinsic properties of the substances whose coexistence constitutes the best of all possible worlds, that are grounded in an absolute first principle, namely God, who is infinite in his knowledge, wisdom, and power. Thus, physical phenomena are grounded in physical conditions, and no metaphysical condition is introduced to explain those phenomena in accordance with the dualistic demand. However, the monistic demand is simultaneously to be met through the derivability of physical conditions from metaphysical conditions, which is not a straightforward continuation of physical grounding beyond the physical. It will, of course, be crucial to say more about what derivability could amount to. Okay. Now, Leibniz explores many variants of this response, and each variant is open to multiple interpretations. Without entering the thicket of Leibniz interpretation, for Kant and German idealism are thorny enough, I want here to give one further articulation of Leibniz's derivability monism, which I find particularly helpful for the illumination of Kant and German idealism. On this articulation, the explanatory conditions appealed to in modern physics involve relational properties, but only non-relational or monadic properties can be derived from an absolute first principle. What is a relational property, and what does Leibniz think is problematic about them? As a first approximation, a relational property is one whose instantiation requires the existence of more than one subject, whereas a monadic property is one whose instantiation requires the existence of only one subject. Thus, to say that Socrates is wiser than Gorgias is not to ascribe a relational property to either Socrates or Gorgias. It is rather to ascribe the monadic property of wisdom to both Socrates and Gorgias, and to compare the degrees to which they possess that property. To say, however, that the sun and the earth are a certain distance apart, and that one exerts a certain force upon the other, is to ascribe to both of those bodies properties that are relational and are not equivalent to any conjunction or comparison of monadic properties. To see what is problem. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think about it as I'm reading along.
But please go on.
Yeah. To see what is problematic, consider the question: what is the ground of a relational property? It cannot be either the nature of one subject or the nature of the other, for neither is sufficient on its own. But if you say that the ground consists in the natures of both subjects, as well as the fact that they are in relation to one another, then your explanation is circular. For the fact that they are in relation to one another is just what you were trying to explain. Okay, to go over that one. So the wisdom between Socrates and Gorgias thing, that makes sense to me. Okay, so you have a determinate concept of wisdom, and Socrates and Gorgias, and then compared to that wisdom and then to each other, and that's how you get Socrates is wiser than Gorgias.
Yeah.
So I can understand how that's not a relational property.
You're right, because there is this third term, wisdom itself.
Yeah.
Right? In which they're compared to. Yeah, that's not the case with distance or forces. Yeah, but, well, there is the concept of distance itself and the concept of force itself. Distance, I think it's more complicated to think about it in that way that I'm proposing. But force, well, when you're talking about a particular force, you are supposing that there is such a thing as the possibility of identifying what force in itself is, and then to compare that which you see to the concept of force and say, well, force is present here. Am I making any sense here?
That makes sense, but I'm not sure that's what Leibniz thought of force. Because remember, like what we think of force nowadays is very different from, say, what Newton thought, and what Newton thought was different from what Leibniz thought. Newton and Leibniz did not have a mutually identical notion of force. So there's a sense in which, for example, distance certainly makes sense as this
it's a relational property.
It's a purely relational thing, and there's no such thing as distance as such, whereas there is wisdom as such. And force, I'm not quite sure what he'll explain as we go on. I'm sure of it.
Let's go.
On the Leibnizian view, in which I am interested here, 1. To ascribe to some subject X the relational property stands in relation to R to Y is to presuppose that there is some substance that represents itself as standing in relation R to Y. And 2, necessarily, if there is some substance that represents itself as standing in relation to R to Y, then there is some substance that represents itself as being such that X stands in relation R to it. I don't know what representing itself means here.
Yeah. It seems like some kind of panpsychism, you know what I mean? Like these kinds of relations that they are actually representations in the mind of the object. I don't know, but anyway, please go on. I think this is going to get clear.
Right. With respect to the first clause, I note first that, on this view, to say that X represents some fact is to ascribe to X a monadic property. This is what contemporary philosophers sometimes call an internalist view of representational content. Second, I am here using the phrase X represents itself as standing in relation R to Y in such a way that there is no guarantee that X is capable of self-consciously ascribing any representation to itself. In Leibniz terminology, not every perceiver need be an apperceiver.
Okay.
In addition, if X is capable of self-consciously ascribing any representation to itself, there's no guarantee that it will be right about how it thinks it represents itself. So it is possible that, although some substance represents itself as standing in relation R to Y, no substance correctly ascribes to itself the representation of itself as standing in relation R to Y. Okay, I'm gonna have to reread this because
I think we should reread it from the Leibnizian view, in which I'm interested here. You know, I think the problem begins here.
So rereading back from the top. On the Leibnizian view, in which I am interested here, 1. To ascribe to some subject X the relational property stands in relation R to Y is to presuppose there is some substance that represents itself as standing in relation R to Y. And 2. Necessarily, if there is some substance that represents itself as standing in relation R to Y, then there is some substance that represents itself as being such that X stands in relation R to it.
Wait, just a moment, Antonio. Can we give some concreteness here so we can think it through, like, with more like, I don't know.
Okay,
let's substitute the out abstractions here and try to think it through. Okay, so let's see. X, let's say Earth. Okay.
Subject Earth stands in relation distance to sun. Yeah, to moon. That's good. Okay, sun.
Anyway, sun, moon,
Earth stands in relation distance to moon. Is to presuppose there is some substance that represents itself as standing in relation R to Y. So, this presupposes that the Earth is.
The Earth is, there is some substance, the Earth, right?
Yeah. Stands in relation.
Substance because it has properties and some of its properties are actually contingent. But anyway, there is Earth.
Earth stands in relation. Represents itself. Standing in relation distance to moon.
To moon. Okay.
And the reason the reason we presuppose that there is some substance that represents itself as standing in relation R to Y, which is the Earth standing in relation distance to moon. So there's relations, but relations are relations of something to something. Therefore, and the only something for Leibniz here is substance. So This is why we are presupposing there is a substance, Earth, in relation distance to the moon.
Or maybe this substance, he is referring to the substance in the strong sense of the word. Substance as in the
being in itself. It's like
you know.
No, I think it's not in the sense of Spinoza. It's more, it's similar, but not exactly. Actually, he does go over in later, either in this chapter or in later chapters, what the difference between this and Spinoza is.
So the word substance here is not very proper to think it through. Okay, but anyway, let's continue.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a sense in substance in which here, it's like the thing in itself. It's like being in itself and being for other. That in order to have the relation which is being for other, obviously there must be a thing in itself.
Yeah.
Because otherwise this whole thing doesn't make any sense.
Okay. So all this talk about representation. Okay, but
I don't know why the talk about representation comes in. I assume it's because Leibniz is an idealist, and the monads are not material entities. They are ideal entities, intellectual entities.
Yeah.
So two, necessarily, if there is some substance that represents itself as standing in relation R to Y, which is, some substance Earth in relation distance to Moon, then there is some substance that represents itself as being such that X, Earth, stands in relation distance to it. So if there is the sun, so the Moon also must be a substance.
So, and the Moon also must be partaking in the same opinion of the Earth.
Yeah.
Okay. Fucking crazy shit. Okay.
So, with respect to the first clause, I note first that on this view, to say that X, the Earth, represents some fact is to ascribe to X, the Earth, a monadic property. This is what contemporary philosophers sometimes call an internalist view of representational content. Second, I am here using the phrase X, the Earth, represents itself as standing in relation R, distance, to Y, Moon, in such a way that there is no guarantee that X, the Earth, is capable of self-consciously ascribing any representation to itself. In Leibniz terminology, not every perceiver need to be an apperceiver. So not everything that's in relation needs to be conscious of that relation.
But so why does Earth stands in this subject of the phrase, you know what I mean? As representing, But anyway, I think that's just okay. Let's continue because this is only a terminology problem here. Okay.
In addition, if X, Earth, is capable of self-consciously ascribing any representation to itself, there is no guarantee that it will be right about how it thinks it represents itself. So it is possible that, although some substance represents itself as standing in relation R, distance, to Y, Moon, no substance correctly ascribes to itself the representation of itself as standing in relation R, distance, to Y, Moon.
Okay.
So
Earth could be wrong?
Earth could be wrong about what it thinks its relationship to the Moon is.
This is a fucking consensualist. I think there is a good example here. I remember when my friends and I were younger, every time a friend of mine would appear saying that he had a girlfriend, we asked him, does she know that? You know what I mean? So like for example, Pedro appears and say, I have a girlfriend, it's Samantha. Oh, does Samantha knows that? So I am the X here representing a certain relation, and I may be wrong, right? But what is the condition that says that I'm wrong or right? What is this third term? In the case of a relationship, it's the other term, right? It's W no epsilon, right? But what about here in this case? Who is going to ascertain that Earth is right or wrong? It's not only epsilon, right? But because maybe epsilon is also wrong.
Which is why
in their wrongness.
Yeah, which is why I think for Leibniz, relational properties aren't real. If I remember correctly, for Leibniz and for Kant later on, the meaning of reality is only ascribed to these substances.
If I knew that at that time, I could have a witty answer. I could say your relationship doesn't exist, dude.
Yeah,
Not even if the girlfriend agrees.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read. Well, I haven't even read the monadology, so I'm talking out of my ass here. I read about it mainly in this book and some other books, but from what I read about it, Leibniz doesn't believe relational properties are real, and he doesn't believe that there are relations at all. All monads, right? It's the pre-established harmony. All monads are completely self-contained, independent entities, which are doing their own things according to their own internal logic. And insofar as all other monads seem to have some kind of harmonic relationship, which is coherent with that monad, it's not because they are relating, it's because each one is already internally determined in such a way that they are acting out in a way that externally appears as coherent and harmonic.
I see. So Leibniz was the monad that discovered that, right?
Yeah.
So please continue.
With respect to the second clause, it is crucial that the necessity mentioned in the second clause is not what Leibniz calls absolute necessity, but rather what he calls hypothetical necessity. Absolute necessity pertains to eternal truths, which subsist in the divine intellect, independently of the divine will. Thus, the relationship between the nature or complete concept of a substance and all monadic properties instantiated by that substance is a matter of absolute necessity, although it is not absolutely necessary that any substance be actualized. Hypothetical necessity, in contrast, depends on the divine will, which, though all-powerful, is always guided by the divine and all-beneficent wisdom. God could create a world in which one substance represents itself as standing in relation R to Y, but there is no substance that represents itself as such that X stands in relation R to it. But God would not create such a world, for his will determines itself to actualize the best of all possible worlds, and the best of all possible worlds is maximally harmonious.
Okay, I'm getting it. Okay. So everything is like the Earth is right, not because it represents itself as in a distance relationship with the moon, but because God in his infinite wisdom would not fool Earth.
Yeah, it's it's like Descartes' thing. Descartes' like, well, we could be deceived by an evil demon. He's like, but that can't happen because God is good.
Nice.
Yeah, God is good. He wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I love how God is like people come up with God when their systems are fucked. They appeal to God wisdom and well intention, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe God is a motherfucker. Well. Okay, continue, please.
Okay, just as a side note, the Jews fully admit to this. Like, not that I've had like very many Jews that I've interactions with, but I've had one where she told me in the Jewish theology, as far as she understood it and practiced it, the Jews are fully cognizant and fully admit that God may be an asshole. And so
this is good theology over here.
So for anything that happens, there might be no other reason than God wanted to dick with you. That's it. And what are you gonna say about it? You're not God.
Yeah. So but it's so funny that these finer details must be explicit only in philosophical parlance. You know what I mean? Like, the guy is simply discussing, well, yes, Earth does represent itself as being in relation distance to the moon. But that's not what makes this claim of representational sureness really justifiable. Because, Earth may be wrong, but Earth is not wrong, because God it has wisdom. God is a nice, all beneficent being, It's so fucking funny.
Yep.
But I'm getting a lecture on Paul's opinion on Leibniz, at least. Now I understand better the idea of pre-established harmony. But how can we explain mistakes on our daily livings? You know?
Mm-hmm. That's where Leibniz later on comes up with like, well, you don't know the real, what is it called? I forget what I think it's, I'm sure it has a name. I just don't remember what it is. But it's basically the idea that God knows, God is good, God has a plan. We are like people living on the canvas of a painting. We're like, we're on a blotch of the Mona Lisa, and we're like, wow, this is fucking ugly, man. But God can see the whole Mona Lisa, and he's like, this is perfect, this is beautiful. Right?
Yeah. So these particular representational mistakes actually contribute to a general perspective. Yeah. I see the point. A particular representation mistakes is actually something which, if you look in a universal, general point of view, in the standpoint of God, it's actually not a mistake.
Yeah.
Right? Or something like that. Okay.
Yeah, that's the argument. Okay, but God would not create such a world, for his will determines itself to actualize the best of all possible worlds, and the best of all possible worlds is maximally harmonious. Thus, the necessity with which each substance's representations of relational property instantiations match the representations of every other substance is not absolute but hypothetical, dependent on the divine will. This is what Leibniz calls pre-established harmony. God chooses to actualize in his creative act exactly the set of possible substances whose representations harmonize maximally with one another.
So there is no way of he is saying maximally. So there is always, God cannot get it perfectly right. That's what it is implying here, right? God looks and say, this is a fucking mess. I will try to do the best I can, but there will be some mistakes here and there. Okay. Maximally.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. The maximally implies that it's not complete harmony, but it's the most harmonious that is possible.
But it's strange because, well, if God created it all, like, all this parlance actually implies that there is a set of possibilities that are present to God. I mean, external to God, and not created by him. It reminds me a bit of Plato and his idea of a God as someone who is actually, he didn't create matter, but he was imposing form on matter throughout time and stuff like that.
Yeah, the demiurge goes, he doesn't create matter, he doesn't create the forms, he looks at the forms and he shapes matter according to the forms.
Yeah, so this God is not that powerful. Like, he cannot get it perfect.
That's one reading. I'm sure Leibniz thinks otherwise, but I forget what his... I think he'll go over like more in depth of why this is.
Let's go.
So important consequences follow from this last point. In principle, all relational property instantiations are derivable from monadic properties of substances, which are in turn grounded in God as their absolute ground. But in fact, only God could perform such a derivation, for he alone knows what substances represent in virtue of their complete concepts. Still, all we need to know, in order to escape Agrippan skepticism, is that the derivation is in principle available. At the same time, however, the monadic properties of substances do not determine relational property instantiations. Instead, God makes it the case that there is no variation in relational properties without some appropriate variation in monadic properties. So the relationship between relational properties and monadic properties is covariance, grounded in a third factor, the harmonizing will of God. Some contemporary philosophers would hesitate even to call this supervenience. It's okay, yeah. Actually, I take it back. This is actually looking very similar to Spinoza's concept of substance. The only thing is that Leibniz hasn't gone the full way towards one substance, which is the only substance. Because Leibniz here is saying, okay, monads work in a certain way, which is is similar to like the exclusivity of substances through attributes and self-explanation, which Spinoza has.
Yeah.
Because here each monad is independent and therefore also self-explaining. And with Spinoza, the link between the infinite plurality of attributes and substances for Spinoza and God is that there is no logical reason why not suppose that there is a substance which has every attribute possible.
When I think my interpretation of Spinoza in that sense is like I depart from the critique of dualism and Spinoza, and from what I have understand, I don't think that would completely apply to Leibniz here, but his critique of polysubstances is the idea that, if there are two substances, they are completely different, right? Yep. They are radically different. They don't have nothing in common between each other, which is all the problem of dualism. Okay, you have resistenza, you have respens cogitante or stuff. How do they relate if they're completely fucking different? They don't share any property. And Spinoza says, well, if they relate, this property, which is the property to which they relate, is actually the whole substance, As I remember, Spinoza, all point about monism is that, well, there is surely you cannot make a case for dualism without presupposing a third substance which would unite them, and that is the substance, and all those two which we thought were substance are actually only perspectives on the same substance, That's how I understood it, at least.
Yeah, there's that argument, but then, so he has that, but he doesn't actually make the argument for why there's only one substance is because he's like, well, we may have a substance which each substance has a different attribute, and therefore, they're independent. They fit the concept of substance. But there's no reason at all in his system for why a substance can't instantiate more than one attribute. So then he goes like, well, then God would just be the substance which has every attribute, because by definition God is infinite. And he's like, and then because we can posit this substance, there just couldn't possibly be another substance at all. So that's the argument as far as I understood it in his the first part of his book. Which is a weaker argument, but still it works. It works for what it does. That because you don't have a reason not to suppose. The fact that you can suppose means that you must suppose that there is.
For instance, take this idea of a third factor, the harmonizing will of God, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's what would explain why things seems to react to one another, right? Because if all monads are self-sufficient, how can you explain that that there are many things in the world, right? And they seem to relate to each other. So the idea is that, well, there is this will of God, and God actually is this common ground in which they partake and in which they seem to be actually interacting, right? So Spinoza would simply say, well, that's the substance, that's the monad. All the others are simply like variations within this properties of this all-encompassing substances, right?
Yeah, he would say they're modes. And he could give that argument, I think. And Leibniz has the God as the monad of monads, which seems, at face, very similar to Spinoza's just total substance, in which Spinoza says, well, this is the only thing that deserves to be called substance. Whereas Leibniz still is like, yeah. Whereas with Leibniz says like, well, God is the monad of monads, but we'll call these other things monads too, instead of just like some other relational term.
Yeah.
But all right. Continuing. I will add one more complication to the Leibnizian picture because it is of special importance to this story, for the story about Kant towards which I am making my way. So far I have distinguished between two levels, the physical and the metaphysical. Leibniz calls that which occurs at the physical level well-founded phenomena. For although only what is on the metaphysical level, God and the substances which with their monadic properties is truly real, what occurs on the physical level is not an illusion, but rather a derivative manifestation of the real. In Leibniz's late writings, however, he introduces a third level, the ideal. Space and time are, he argues, neither real nor phenomenal, but ideal. This is because space and time are neither substances nor monadic properties, nor are they relational properties. Space and time are orders of relations. In Leibniz's view, they are nothing more than imaginary constructions that enable us, with our finite minds, to represent relational property instantiations, thus to represent in a confused way the harmoniousness of the world. Thus space and time lack reality, even derivative reality, altogether.
See where he's going here?
So, here we see a direct line all the way to Kant from Leibniz.
Yeah. Space and time are not real, or they are only like concepts that we use to try to figure things out.
Yep.
Okay.
Leibniz's way of maintaining both the monistic thesis and the dualistic thesis is strikingly elegant. On the one hand, it seems correct to say that, on this view, there are, at the metaphysical level, no relational property instantiations at all, only monadic property instantiations. Yet, pre-established harmony entitles us to speak just as if there were relational property instantiations. On the other hand, the supposition of God's will to harmony safeguards the closure of physical explanation, for God himself decrees in his creative act that the world will operate just as if there were relational property instantiations, and indeed just as if there were physical laws governing those instantiations. So although any true claim to the effect that some relational property is instantiated will be ultimately grounded in an absolute ground, it would be wrong to bypass the physical laws and to ground such a claim directly in a special act of divine will. Thus to say that the reason why the sun and the earth are at a certain distance from each other is that God so wills it, while true, would be no substitute for physical explanation. Physical explanation in terms of relational properties constitutes a closed system. Yet physical explanation is grounded in metaphysical explanation and ultimately in theology. Without metaphysical and theological foundations, physical explanation would be vulnerable to Agrippan skepticism. Thus Leibniz can maintain at once both that physics and metaphysics are genuinely distinct disciplines, and that metaphysics deals with reality, whereas physics deals with the merely phenomenal manifestation of that reality. Leibniz can acknowledge the duality of physical and metaphysical grounding, while at the same time affirming the monistic view that there is, from the metaphysical point of view, that only God can fully occupy only one series of grounds, which terminates in the absolute intellect, wisdom, and will of God.
You know what that reminds me of? I've seen it in, I think it was Chesterton. You know Chesterton? And there is this interesting history about a theologian that when they discovered that there are like people believed at that time that the earth was 10,000 years old, and they discovered dinosaurs, right? And then this very, very smart and sharp theologian came up with a explanation that would like actually accept the fact that there are such a things as dinosaur bones around, and that the earth is 10,000 years old. You know what he said? He said that actually God created the earth 10,000 years ago, but he created it as if it had millions of years, you know? Brilliant, fucking brilliant.
Yep. There's no limit to the ingenuity of the understanding, that's for sure. (1.3) Notwithstanding the elegance of Leibniz's solution, it is never straightforwardly an option for Kant, even at his most Leibnizian early in his career. For Kant assumes from the outset that Leibnizian physics has been surpassed by Newton's. However, Newtonianism also has its difficulties. Only hints are to be found in the Newtonian corpus about how to respond to the problem of Agrippan skepticism, and these hints are deeply troubling to anyone who, like Kant, follows Leibniz in taking that problem, as well as the integrity of physics, seriously. Ooh, I'm not sure that Newton will really surpass Leibniz. I need to read more of Hegel's Philosophy of Nature to see what he thinks. I know he hates Newton. I think he definitely hates Newton far more than Leibniz. So yeah, he must think Leibniz did something better than Newton. I think he considers Leibniz's concept of force to be more logically consistent and honest than Newton's, for sure.
Yeah, but effectiveness is at Newton's side.
Yeah, that is true. Newton definitely had a far more effective formulation with applicability.
We could predict, because I'm not talking about Leibniz here, to be clear. I'm talking about his image of Leibniz, right? In the end, he's running away from the Agrippan challenge, because he's simply saying, well, I've created this metaphysical system that says that in principle it would be possible to respond to Agrippan, but only God can do that. What's the fucking difference? Concretely, only God can do that, because it's all about an abstract talking, right? In principle, in the abstract, everything could be derivated from monadic relations, right? But no particular case of relational properties could be by human minds derived. So okay, he's saying that God could answer the problem, but okay, we all know that from the start, right? God is omniscient.
Yeah. I definitely think it's an illusory answer. I don't think he's running away. I think it's a very honest way to try to answer it, although it fails.
It answers it in the abstract.
Yeah.
It's like saying, take for instance the idea of efficient causality, right? As the ultimate principle of all explanation. Okay, a scientist can say, well, I use observation, and in observation, everything has a fucking physical cause, let's say, a mechanical cause. But the researcher or the scientist himself is a finite being and he's observing, so he has no way of simply asserting that in all universe and all that there is, efficient causality is indeed effective. I think it's a similar problem, but I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's certainly in that family of problems. Let's continue. 1.3. We read the first paragraph. Two types of trouble may be distinguished on what Leibnizians would regard as the physical and the metaphysical levels. On the physical level, the trouble concerns the notion of force. Both Leibniz and Newton see that physics cannot be purely mechanical, but can also be dynamic. This shared insight, arising in both cases from a critical encounter with Cartesianism, leads them in radically different directions. As I have said, Leibniz is committed to the closure of physical grounding, but is simultaneously committed to its derivativeness from metaphysical grounding, which terminates in an absolute ground. To be sure, only God could carry out the derivations in detail. Hence, only God could construct a system whose possibility is demanded by derivability, monism. But if we, who are incapable of constructing the system, are nevertheless to be saved from Agrippan skepticism, then we must be capable of grasping the constructability of the system.
Okay.
Our grasp of the constructibility of the system is twofold. On the one hand, we have a progressive grasp that starts from the metaphysical foundations and tends, as it were, forward towards the physical phenomena. Thus, we grasp a priori the existence of God in certain principles of his activity, as well as the existence of created substances in certain principles of their activity. On the other hand, we have a regressive grasp that starts from the phenomena and tends, as it were, backward toward their metaphysical foundations. We cannot regress to these foundations in, as it were, an uninterrupted line, for that would contradict the closure of the physical. But we can find the place where the physical shows its lack of self-sufficiency, and we can find the place where the metaphysical promises to fill that lack. In particular, the basic notion of Leibniz's mature dynamics is what he calls derivative force, which points backwards to the metaphysical notion of primitive force. Certainly, derivative force is relational and is not equivalent to any monadic predicate directly ascribable to a metaphysical substance. Thus, although it plays a fundamental role in the explanation of physical phenomena, derivative force is, like any relational property instantiation, insufficient to explain itself. It is a mere modification, yet physics cannot tell us what it is a modification of. However, derivative force is fundamentally asymmetric. It is exerted by an active body upon a passive body. This asymmetry indicates that, although derivative force is manifest only in physical interactions, it is grounded in a monadic primitive force that pertains to the metaphysical substance manifesting its activity through the activity of the active body.
Yeah, that kind of answers the question I had about if force is or is not in the end a monadic relation. There is this idea of a primitive force, right? Which is monadic.
Yeah. Yep. Within the mature Newtonian dynamics of Principia Mathematica, force is equally fundamental, but is conceived of in an incompatible and radically new way. In particular, gravitational force relations are conceived of as symmetric and reciprocal. To be sure, we may speak of agents and patients for the sake of convenience, but in reality every body is equally both agent and patient, since each part of matter exerts gravitational force upon every other and has force exerted upon it by every other. Speaking of which, beyond two bodies, physics is incapable of calculating such forces.
Really?
This is what's famously called the three-body problem. Beyond two bodies, gravity is beyond the power of physics to calculate.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's just because with a two-body problem, the relationship is reciprocally immediate between them, and that's doable. With the three bodies, you have to calculate one, like A to B, B to A to C, C to A, B to C, C to B in the same go. And mathematics, the structure of mathematics somehow does not allow that.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
So we are incapable of calculating anything more than two bodies in any gravitational relation.
This is interesting, man.
In the absence of asymmetry, force no longer points backwards to the metaphysical foundations of physics. Kant's recognition of the innovative character of Newton's conception of force and of the resulting incompatibility between Leibnizianism and Newtonianism plays a central role in his thinking. First, in the formulation of his pre-critical project synthesizing Leibniz and Newton, later in the idea that dynamic community is a categorical concept, and indeed, as we shall see shortly, in the formulation of Transcendental Idealism. Okay, yeah, this makes sense. I said earlier that Hegel probably holds Leibniz in higher esteem than Newton. Like I said, I'm not sure about that. It's kind of my intimation. But this reminds me about the stuff of the phenomenology, and that's definitely true. In the phenomenology, Newton's concept of force comes after Leibniz as a sublation of it. Although Hegel doesn't see that is properly using force, which belongs to the Leibnizian conception, but rather is starting to talk, it's where the talk about law begins. Laws of nature. So, rather than the force of gravity, we're talking about the law of gravity. Would Newton nevertheless acknowledge the derivative status of gravitational force? With this question, we move on to the metaphysical level. Newton is notoriously cagey about the foundations of physics, especially in his published writings. As we shall see, there is some reason, from a Leibnizian point of view, to worry about whether there could be genuinely metaphysical foundations of Newtonian physics. Yet it does seem that, like Leibniz, Newton cannot accept the idea that physical force is primitive. If Newton's views are put into the framework of a response to the Agrippan trilemma, then it seems that Newton must join Leibniz in giving the second response. Brute facts, infinite regresses, and circles cannot be the whole story. There must be genuine groundings which terminate in an absolute ground. Gravitational force must then be derivative because it would otherwise constitute a brute fact. I mean, goddamn it.
So Newton is like an empiricist in the public and a metaphysician in the sheets.
Yeah, and I don't think he wasn't even hiding it either. There are ways in which, like in the Principia Mathematica, he feigned what would he called? He feigned humility. Like he says, well, as for what gravity is, that's only God truly knows. Then he writes the Optics later, and in that he actually gives what he thinks might be an explanation for what gravity really is. And it's an aether explanation, a pressure gradient, where aether is this universal medium in which all things, which fills all space, and all physical bodies are moving through it. And gravity is the manifestation of the relationship between physical bodies, that medium, and a certain pressure gradient of that medium relationship to local physical bodies. Such that I don't know if you had like certain classes in the equivalent of high school in Portugal or Brazil.
I studied in Brazil.
Yeah, because here we had one class, and they showed us, like density, like you have fluid densities, and they showed us a tube. They filled it, with honey, with oil, with water, and some other stuff. And how the densities of each fluid, since they're dense, they will arrange themselves in a relationship of layers. Once they've distinguished themselves out after time. And so if you drop a certain thing with a certain density, it will only sink to the level of density of an equal density layer. But if a layer is denser than it will act as a physical, kind of a solid barrier for it. So it will rest itself at its proper density layer and will stay there. But so long as the other layers are not as dense as it will sink through them. So, honey will sink below water and oil. Water will be between, honey at the bottom, water in the middle, and oil at the top, because the density is less or higher. So for Newton, that was his explanation of gravity, that the reason bodies move towards each other is because they're less dense than certain gradients of the ether.
See? Which is coming back to the idea of substance, right?
Yeah, it's a similar.
The universal substance of which everything is only a variation.
Yeah. Although it's inconsistent because aether is a kind of substance different from matter. Matter is a kind of substance different from aether, and it's not quite clear what the relationship of them is, although they do relate. But I said earlier, like, God damn, man, it's such a shame that after Newton, so much of physics lost itself in mindlessness. Because the fact that you can, because I mean, Newton was thinking, Leibniz was thinking. And so you can follow their thought, and there's something intelligible there. And then later on, this was just completely given up for the most part.
The rule is clear: shut up and calculate.
Yep.
That's the rule, and that's why we are here too, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. So Newton's conception of the absolute ground differs radically from that of Leibniz. While in Leibniz's view the divine will must play a role subordinate to the roles of divine intellect and divine wisdom, Newton privileges divine will. He regards God primarily as the Pantocrator, the one who exercises dominion over all through the supremacy of his will. Thus, Newtonians like Samuel Clarke reject the idea of hypothetical necessity, which they see as restricting the exercise of divine will. From a Leibnizian point of view, however, this rejection is disastrous because it is precisely the idea of hypothetical necessity that grounds the explanatory closure of physics. Once the divine will may be invoked, not as the ground of the natural order which, once actualized, is law-governed, but as the ground of particular events, what will become of the very notion of physical law? The physicist who runs out of ingenuity may simply invoke the divine will. Indeed, Newton seems to do just that in his correspondence with Richard Bentley, where Newton suggests that the inability of physics to explain every feature of the universe, and the consequent need to invoke the divine will, for example to explain the formation of the solar system, counts as proof of God's existence. Moreover, on at least one occasion, Newton publicly envisages a direct invocation of the divine will as the ground of gravitational force. To Leibniz, this is not merely an ad hoc explanation. It is a transgression of the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical, hence a threat to the integrity of physics. Kant seems to have shared this Leibnizian response. Indeed, his major contribution to physics is arguably his attempt to show that, despite what Newton had written to Bentley, the formation of the solar system can be explained by means of Newtonian forces alone.
You know what that reminds me of? There is a whole. I think you know that guy. There's a guy. He goes around saying that physics is nowadays is shit, and that people are more and more relying on what he calls natural constants. Is that it? Is that how it's called?
Natural constants.
Those fucking numbers that appears. Unsicher.
Unsicher, Alexander Unsicher.
Like there are those numbers, and people ask why these numbers, and everybody's like, well, it is what it is, my friend. Shut up and calculate, right? And he says that the problems that that which the most valuable advancements in physics are actually transforming or explaining why that which was once considered a natural constant is actually not a natural constant and can be explained by further
factors and causes.
But do you see how that will lead us to infinite regress, right? Because there will always be some present content that will be referred to explain that which was once a natural constant, but it was discovered that it was not, and stuff like that.
Yes, and that happens. That distinction also. So this is going on with Leibniz, but it's also in Hegel, and I think this is part of what he ends up arguing in the book, that German idealism radicalizes what Leibniz was trying to do and just does it better, makes it consistent with itself, and finally manages to link it properly. Because with Hegel, the same thing happens. Like Hegel says, you will never explain all of nature, simply because there will always be more. There's always more of nature. Nature's always, everything's outside itself forever, without end. Nature is the place in which infinite regress just is its very nature. So in a way, Now, I don't remember if Leibniz believes this. He probably didn't. But with Hegel, like there's no such thing as the closure of physics. Physics is just radically open because it cannot close. It's impossible. So physics will never fully explain itself as physics physically, just because there's just too much. Well, not too much. There's just literally infinite to account for. It's just not possible. All right, continuing. Indeed, the Newtonian transgression of the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical endangers metaphysics no less than physics. In the theology of dominion, at which Newton's published work only hints, Leibniz rightly sees a threat to the absoluteness of God. In Newton's view, infinite space is the domain within which infinite divine dominion is exercised. When, in unpublished thoughts, Newton considers the possibility that the divine will is the ground of gravitational force, his idea seems to be that divine omnipresence underlies the universality of a force that does not require contact. It follows from Newton's view that the existence of infinite space is a necessary condition for the exercise of divine dominion. But then what makes it the case that God's existence is the absolute ground of the existence of space, rather than it being the cause that the existence of infinite space is the ground of the existence of God? I misread that. Rather than it being the case that the existence of infinite space is the ground of the existence of God. The difficulty is not merely that Newton's theology is unorthodox, although it certainly is. Rather, the difficulty is that it is unclear how Newton's theology can play the role required for an adequate response to Agrippan's skepticism, a response in which God is the ultimate absolute ground. Kant also accepts this Leibnizian criticism of Newton. Consequently, a centerpiece of his pre-critical project is a new a priori demonstration of God as existent absolute ground. Like Newton, Kant rejects the ontological proof of God's existence developed by Anselm and revived by Descartes. But like Leibniz, Kant cannot rely, as Newton does, on a regressive argument from particular failures of physical explanation, because he seeks to safeguard both the integrity of physics and the absoluteness of God. Let me reread that little section about space being the cause of God. It follows from Newton's view that the existence of infinite space is a necessary condition for the exercise of divine dominion. But then what makes it the case that God's existence is the absolute ground of the existence of space, rather than it being the case that the existence of infinite space is the ground of the existence of God? So the fact that it's a necessary condition for the exercise of divine dominion, because it is a condition, it can be seen as a cause for God.
Yeah. But it's all the discussion is all touching to me to this point of the pre-existence of something which external to God, and which in the end is the condition of possibility of God's wielding of his will, and that would completely destroy the idea that God created it all, right?
Yeah.
So, there is always this, is there a given to God? We can frame this in the problem of given, right? If God created everything, nothing was given to him, right?
Yeah.
But if there is a pre-existing set of conditions over which God acts upon, who said that these conditions are not reversed, and actually the infinite space is the cause of God? I think that's the main issue here, right?
Yeah, I would say that certainly
God
seems like the issue.
To be infinite, he cannot have anything given to him, which is a pity, because I would love to give a gift to him sometimes.
Yeah, certainly a problem with how this is getting shaped up.
Hegel's solutions is amazing. God gives himself stuff.
Yeah, and not only that, he always already gave himself those determinations. By the way, what's up, Hyperion? I see you here. Anyways, continuing. Kant's precritical project is based on an ingenious idea about how to be a Newtonian while giving a derivability monist response to Agrippan skepticism. The idea, as I understand it, is to preserve an approximately Leibnizian account of what is absolutely necessary while developing a new account of what is hypothetically necessary that can serve as the basis for Newtonian physics. Thus, Kant's central point is that, while God indeed wills the maximally harmonious world, that world consists not of a pre-established harmony between substances that do not interact with one another, but rather of a harmony between substances that are continually and reciprocally interactive. In short, although there is no substantial interaction in virtue of absolute necessity, there is a dynamic community among substances in virtue of hypothetical necessity. Thus, Kant restores the human ability to grasp the systematic derivations which God alone can carry out. On the one hand, Kant provides a progressive demonstration of the existence of God as absolute ground of substances with monadic properties, all of which is a matter of absolute necessity. On the other hand, he shows that Newtonian physics, with its fundamental notion of a dynamic community, points backwards to its foundation in the harmonious community of these metaphysical substances, which is a matter of hypothetical necessity. Through these two moves, Kant seems to have shown how to be a Newtonian in physics, while maintaining the Leibnizian duality of physics and metaphysics. He also preserves the Leibnizian idea that, although physical grounding is both closed and vulnerable to the Agrippan trilemma, it is nevertheless comprised within a single system, along with metaphysical grounding, which determines in an absolute first principle.
This is interesting here because I think the problem here is like these guys they couldn't believe in the idea of chaos, right? Like, for example, there is an explosion, and a metaphysician of that time would think, well, there is necessity over there, so things should have happened the way they happened. So the simple idea of physical laws are not able to satisfy them, right? Because physical laws are formal, right? They act upon a certain circumstance which itself can be considered contingent, right? The initial conditions of a system are contingent, so the law itself cannot explain for the necessity of what's going on, right? So they need to actually be able to metaphysically explain why that happened the way that happened, and law does not apply over here, right? Law is only like an illusion in our mind that we make up to try to figure things out while we're here, but they cannot account for the necessity of a certain set of initial conditions in the given in the universal system, right?
I think like where it says here in this paragraph, thus Kant's central point is that while God indeed wills the maximally harmonious world, that world consists not of a pre-established harmony between substances that do not interact with one another, but rather of a harmony between substances that are continually and reciprocally interactive. In short, although there is no substantial interaction in virtue of absolute necessity, there is a dynamic community among substances in virtue of hypothetical necessity.
So the problem of absolute necessity, right?
Well,
if I throw a given ball at meter tall with an initial speed of x and stuff like that, this will happen. But that's not enough. Why are we throwing this ball? Why this ball in specific? Why, right? So what is the necessity of the ball itself and all those conditions, right?
So as I'm understanding this right now, this is Kant saying, okay, there are substances. The substances do not, as substances, affect each other. They don't affect each other substantially. But the relationship to each other is real. So they are continuously and reciprocally interactive. But that interaction does not go beyond their externality. It never goes within them. So it's mechanism, right? It's like it's what Hegel calls mechanism, where the objective is, the objective relationships do not have any determination on the objects as objects themselves.
Yeah, I think one difficulty of following what these guys is that it's very difficult for contemporary minds to understand the kind of ambition that is going on here, right? Of intellectual ambition that is going on here. Like, it's very difficult to understand. Why are you not satisfied with balls, man? Come on, no, I want absolute necessity. If, like, I farted today, why did that happen? I am not satisfied with a physiological explanation that there are bacteria in my guts and stuff like that.
Yeah,
the kind of ambition is brilliant. It's amazing.
Yeah, according to Newton, my cat farted because God directly willed it so.
What? Your cat farted because...
because God directly willed it so.
God is willing some strange stuff these days, man.
Oh yeah, I think it's hard for people to take that Newtonian, even the Leibnizian view nowadays, because the world seems so chaotic nowadays. So people are like, how could God make a world like this, right?
Yeah.
So, continuing to 1.4. As Kant himself comes to realize, his pre-critical synthesis of Leibnizianism and Newtonianism has serious problems. This realization provides part of the motivation for his Copernican revolution. I will argue, however, that Kant continues throughout to respond to the Leibnizian problem of simultaneously satisfying both the dualistic demand and the monistic demand. As I have said, Kant restores the regressive linkage between Newtonian physics and its metaphysical foundations by developing a Newtonian account of hypothetical necessity that neither Leibniz nor Newton ever envisaged. However, as he himself comes to realize the constructibility of the system of grounds, our ability not to perform but at least to grasp the possibility of the derivation remains problematic. For there remains an unbridgeable gap between the metaphysical substances with their monadic predicates posited at the metaphysical level of absolute necessity and the reciprocally interactive community of those substances posited at the metaphysical level of hypothetical necessity. Under the influence of Newton's conception of inherent force as inertial, Kant regards substances at the level of absolute necessity as wholly inactive. Without interaction, he argues, in a way quite foreign to Leibniz, substances would be static. Only as a matter of hypothetical necessity do substances change. But now it is impossible to grasp the possibility of change, hence the derivability of physical events, from the complete concept of substances. Indeed, although Kant continues to posit the monadic properties that compromise complete concepts, and although he posits what he calls physical monads, which express substances at the physical level, for he continues to affirm with Leibniz that relational properties can only be instantiated by substances that have non-relational properties, these non-relational properties have no other role whatsoever. They satisfy a necessary condition for substantial existence, but they make no grounding contribution whatsoever. It is mysterious what they could be, since, unlike Leibniz, Kant appears to take an externalist view of representations. In Kant's pre-critical project, monadic properties play the role of prime matter, inheriting its status as an enigma. To see the difficulty, let us again consider Leibniz's pre-established harmony. On this view, the monadic properties of substances are principles of activity which make a crucial grounding contribution. To imagine the possibility of grasping the complete concepts of substances is at the same time to imagine the possibility of grasping the pre-established harmony underlying physical law. For what God does in his act of creation is to actualize the set of substances whose monadic properties match. Consequently, although there is a distinction between absolute necessity and hypothetical necessity, God performs a single act of creation, And if we could grasp the complete concepts of substances at the level of absolute necessity, then we could grasp also the set of substances comprising the best possible world. In contrast, on Kant's pre-critical view, the reciprocal relational properties that substances have once they are actualized within the best possible world cannot be known on the sole basis of the monadic predicates of those substances. It seems that God must perform two acts of creation. He must actualize a certain set of substances with their monadic predicates, and he must also institute a dynamic community of those substances that gives rise to reciprocally relational properties in no way derivable from monadic properties.
This does remind me of the problem of law in Hegel's phenomenology, right? Reminds me a lot of it.
Similar, yes.
You see, if you take law by itself, it has no content by itself. It only states we have these kinds of relationships, and if we are given a set of conditions, you can predict it. But these set of conditions themselves are not simply given. So, as I understand it is in this sense. So God performed two acts of creation. The first, let's say that he established
material bodies. Like it would be he established material bodies
and the content. Right, and then he established a certain law.
Yeah.
But he left it open. I don't know, like why. Because all the chain of events will be conditioned by the first conditions, right? Okay, like if we begin here, everything is going by absolute necessity, by the law to develop like this. You know what I mean? So I don't know if I'm getting it. But please continue.
If I could try to clarify. So Leibniz's position is
Please.
God creates substances. Each substance is completely self-contained in its concept. It represents itself to itself as having things that appear to it to be external relations or relations as such. But that's an illusion. They're not real. Whatever the monad is doing, it is doing of its own internal accord, and it's doing only in relationship to itself, not into another. And there's this clearly established harmony. So what Kant is doing, Kant says, okay, God makes the monads, the substances, but then he makes the dynamic community, which is, the bodies of matter and the law of gravity. But and what you're saying is true, that this relates to Hegel's concept of law in the phenomenology, where Hegel's critique of that is precisely this. That with this conception, from the body, you do not get the law, and from the law, you do not get the bodies.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. That's the problem with this. So what Kant is trying to do, where he's like, we're trying to link, we want to have physical closure, where physics explains physics, physically, but there's got to be a way in which physics somehow links itself internally, logically at least, to metaphysics. But because he's doing this two-act creation thing, he can't do it.
Yeah. There will always be this gap, right? In which these relational properties will not be able to be referred to the monadic properties, right?
Yeah.
Monadic relations. Okay. Yeah. We are falling into I get you.
To be sure, Kant says that God performs a single creative act, but this is nothing more than a promissory note that he lacks the resources to redeem. He attains this realization himself in 1764 when he sees what he calls real ground-consequence relations, that is, hypothetically necessary or physical causal relations, cannot be grasped on the basis of what he calls logical, that is, absolutely necessary relations. To employ a term Leibniz used in criticism of Locke, Kant's Newtonian metaphysics of community is superadded to his Leibnizian metaphysics of substance. So Kant has not succeeded in meeting the monistic demand.
Yeah. There will always be two explanations, parallel explanations, the monadic and the physical one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or rather, the monadic and the relational.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so, nor has he succeeded in meeting the dualistic demand. Kant thinks that, unlike Newton, he can avoid the physicalization of theology. Like Newton and Gassendi before him, Kant rejects Descartes' version of the ontological proof of God's existence. But if our knowledge of God's existence were to rest solely on a posteriori grounds, we would be unable to resist the temptation to make God part, to be sure, the supreme part, but part nevertheless of nature. Thus Kant develops his own a priori proof, or at least a basis for such a proof, which can alone constrain the analogies by which we characterize God. The argument, which, as we shall see, continues to be important after the critical turn, and indeed continues to be important for the development of German idealism, is, in brief, as follows. Concepts of things are composed of real determinations. That is, predicates signifying properties capable of composing essences. If concepts of things are to be possible, one might say if conceptualizable things are to be possible, then real determinations must be available. There must therefore be a stock of available real determinations, the sum total of whose possible combinations would be the sum total of possible concepts of things. This stock must be available prior to the actual existence of anything, for it constitutes the possibility of anything, and things are possible before they become actual, if indeed they ever do. However, this omnitudo realitatis, sum total of reality, as Kant calls it, is itself merely a stock of possible thoughts of possible properties, and cannot subsist without some actual basis. That basis, Kant argues, must be God, considered as ens realissimum, most real being, the unique being from whose real determinations all other real determinations may be derived. So he takes the Aristotelian route. Are you familiar with that, Pedro? This version of Aristotle's argument for God, that God is
not very much.
Yeah. So Aristotle. So Hegel's an actualist, where Hegel says the actual is the real thing that precedes possibility and grounds possibility. There's no such thing as possibility as such. It's nonsense. Aristotle thinks that too. That possibility as possibility can never become actuality. It needs something actual to draw it from possibility to actuality. So Aristotle says God must be the pure act, which draws all possible things, which in this case would also be prime matter, into actuality or form. Mm-hmm. So God is both the pure act and telos, which also, because of its actuality, its act is what acts upon possibility to draw it into actuality.
I see.
Yeah, so that's what this is writing of.
I think it's funny here because I am looking at it, thinking about what Kant became afterwards, right? And this omnitudo realitatis, some total reality, is ontologized here, right? So it is an individual, right? It is God. And as I see it in Kant and later works, it becomes simply the I, right? The transcendental I. The transcendental I is this sum of total reality, this a stock of available real determinations, right? Am I following it?
I think that is related. I'm not sure it's exactly the same, but it is definitely related. Because at least on
AI
some readings,
is the source of all determinations, all possible determinations, and
yeah,
everything which is able to be a possible object of experience can only be through the combination of these various determinations which are already available in thinking itself.
yeah. There's a very strong link between that and God.
And Fichte actually radicalizes that. That's why he says, we are God. The I is God.
Yep. So let's see. This demonstration of God's existence as absolute ground enables Kant to avoid the problematic character of Newton's theology, which runs the risk of subjecting God to spatial and ultimately sensible conditions, hence of undermining the absoluteness of God required for an adequate escape from the Agrippan trilemma. But an analogue of the problem emerges in Kant's philosophy of mind, as he himself comes to see. As the Newtonian God is supposed to be omnipresent in space without being a space-filling body, so the pre-critical Kantian mind is supposed to be omnipresent in the human body without being the body that fills that space. But just as Newton has no way of explaining the special non-corporeal way in which God is supposed to inhabit space, so Kant has no way to explain the special non-corporeal way in which the mind is supposed to inhabit space. All the analogies with the corporeal are available. In the absence of a progressive demonstration of the mind's existence and character, there is no constraint on those analogies. But in the absence of constraint, analogy may run riot. The mental becomes not an immaterial but rather a quasi-material realm in which we are free to postulate quasi-physical forces for the sake of explanation, although sensible phenomena may neither verify nor falsify our postulations. As Kant relates in 1766, he makes the disconcerting discovery that Emanuel Swedenborg, who he regards as a fanatical visionary, has described a world in which there is a dynamic community of minds, a world to which Kant's pre-critical project might equally lead. The idea of mental community represents an illicit intrusion of the physical into the metaphysical, whereas the idea of a physical monad represents an illegitimate incursion of the metaphysical into the physical. The duality demand has not been met. I need to read that book. I think the book's title is Visions of a Mystic or something.
Yeah.
Or something of a visionary.
Yeah. I've read it, a bit of it, but it's very difficult, man.
Yeah,
Very
I've only read about
convoluted.
it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's convoluted because Swedenborg is convoluted. But the fact that
Much more
he,
convoluted.
the fact that he spent time doing that is crazy. Not crazy in a bad sense, but just like kind of very, very surprising. Because unless Kant considers this to be serious, he wouldn't have spent time on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it is not an easy reading at all. At all. And he's very he's very verberagic, man. Oh my God. It's nightmare. At least for me, it was nightmare. But anyway.
Yeah, this thing about dynamic community of minds, in which you could have direct mental to mental effects in the same way that you have body to body effects in the natural world. This scare is not the right word, but it's certainly it is scandalous to Kant, and Kant does not want to believe this.
Who doesn't want privacy? Come on. Absolute privacy of my inwardness. Please don't mess up with it.
Whew, yeah. Kant's response to this realization focuses first on the duality demand. He insists on a rigorous separation of the sensible and the intellectual, and he seeks a diagnosis of the fallacies of subreption into which he himself has fallen. The result is the inaugural dissertation of 1770, with its initial version of the Kantian dualisms between appearances and things in themselves, and between sensibility and understanding. As we shall see, when we consider Kant's mature versions of these dualisms, they are subject to a range of interpretations that vary considerably with respect to their ontological commitments to things in themselves. On the ontologically weakest interpretation, Kant is said to make only non-referring uses to the phrase thing in itself, involving no ontological commitments whatsoever. On the ontologically strongest interpretation, Kant is said to use the phrase to refer to entities that exist in some supernatural world where they have their own metaphysical characters about which we can know something, if not much. We may presume that, however one interprets the mature versions of these dualisms, it will be agreed that Kant's 1770 view must be interpreted in the ontologically strongest fashion. Through the faculty of the understanding, we know things as they really are in the intelligible or numeral world, where they constitute a dynamic community. Through the faculty of sensibility, we know things as they appear in the sensible or phenomenal world.
Okay. So, like, the thing in itself would be in an analogy, what Leibniz would say, the monadic relations, right? And we would forever be stuck within the possibility of only explaining the relational properties or whatever. Is that it?
Yeah, the sensuous would be relational. The understanding would be the monadic substances.
So he can achieve the closure here, right? Because physics explains itself. We cannot appeal to the things in themselves, to absolute necessity to explain this dynamic community of bodies. But he also will be meeting the dualistic demand, right? Let's not mess the physics with metaphysics and stuff like that. But what about the monistic challenge? It will become like a conscientialist monism. I don't know.
Yeah. Let's see where this goes. At this stage, much of Kant's mature account of sensibility is already in evidence. Until 1768, Kant has held, along with Leibniz, that space is not phenomenal but merely ideal, an order of relations that serves as a convenient means of representation for finite minds who lack an adequate grasp of divine harmony. Indeed, although the details are never fully worked out, Kant has a more promising view in this respect than Leibniz. For space is a whole in which the position of each object is related to the position of each coexistent object, which is structurally similar to the dynamic community that Kant regards as maximally harmonious, but not obviously similar to the pre-established correspondences that Leibniz regards as maximally harmonious. In 1768, however, Kant becomes convinced that, as Newton maintains against Leibniz, space cannot be adequately understood as an order posterior to dynamic relations, but must be understood rather as a framework prior to dynamic relations. What is it? What is it that he calls the critique of pure reason? A priori intuition?
Forms of sensibility.
Forms of sensibility. Yeah, it's a form of sensibility, but it is also an a priori concept itself, right?
Yes. The problem with calling it a concept is that concepts actually, they unite stuff. You know what I mean? So they are understood to take particular things and put them in a sense in a certain relation of unity, of synthesis. And I wouldn't say that space is actually synthesizing stuff. You know what I mean? Like, to say that the apple is in the space is not to put the apple within the concept of space, you know?
Yeah, true. At least within Kant's view. I think with Hegel's view, stuff changes, but It's a completely different dynamic. So yes, this does not mean, however, that Kant becomes a Newtonian absolutist, ascribing metaphysical reality to space. In 1770, he argues that through prior to dynamic relations, space is nevertheless ideal. I think that was supposed to be though prior. In 1770, he argues that though prior to dynamic relations, space is nevertheless ideal. But the priority of space alters the meaning and significance of the term ideal. For Kant no longer distinguishes, like Leibniz, between the phenomenality of the physical and the ideality of the spatial. Instead, the physical is, as such, spatial and hence ideal. At the same time, space is no longer derivable from anything real to which it is posterior, not even from the derivative reality of physical force. Thus, space is subjective, a form that cannot be presumed to have any import beyond its necessity for our human sensibility. And thus Kant accords to space and to the sensible objects that inhabit it a status less even than the derivative reality of Leibnizian phenomena. I think, Pedro, we could say that space here is less than nothing.
Yeah.
Although sensibility enables mathematical and physical knowledge of phenomena or things as they appear, the understanding, according to Kant's dissertation, yields metaphysical knowledge of noumena or things as they are. And things turn out to be just as Kant's earlier account of hypothetical necessary harmony, inspired by Newtonian physics, says they are. In a dynamic community that is grounded not in the existence alone, that is, the monadic predicates, of the constituent substances, but rather in their common, divine, and absolute creator. Now, there can be no question that Kant is making a sustained effort to meet the dualistic demand. Indeed, one might be forgiven for thinking that he has entirely abandoned all hope of simultaneously meeting the monistic demand. After all, sensible phenomena inhabit one world, intelligible noumena another, and it is to these distinct worlds that the cognitive faculties of sensibility and understanding are oriented. In what sense, then, could phenomena be said to be ultimately grounded in the absolute ground? Within the framework established by the Agrippan trilemma, if Kant gives up the monistic demand, he must either become an Agrippan skeptic about knowledge of phenomena, or else he must say that such knowledge is genuine despite its lack of absolute grounding. But I think that there is evidence that Kant has not adopted either of these positions and that he remains committed to the monistic demand. Indeed, Kant's account of the intelligible world, known by the understanding, is introduced for the express purpose of grounding the dynamic community of phenomena. Quote, "What is the principle upon which this relation of all substances itself rests, and which, when seen intuitively, is called space?" Unquote. It is not enough that we have intuitive knowledge of all-encompassing space as the ground of physical community. We also need to have conceptual knowledge of this ground. In other words, we need to be able to grasp, if not some principle from which space is progressively derivable. For if it were derivable, then it would retain some degree of objectivity and reality. Then at least some principle of which space is a derivative or dependent expression. Even if we cannot grasp the possibility of a progressive derivation of space, we should at least be able to grasp the regressive indication by which space points back to metaphysical reality. In the dissertation, the monistic demand is satisfied by a structural analogy between the phenomenal and noumenal worlds. As space is the ground of physical community, so God is the ground of metaphysical community. To be sure, space is not an absolute ground. There is no reason why space is as it is. But space may be regarded as the phenomenal omnipresence of God, the derivative expression of the absolute ground. And armed with his progressive proof of God's existence, which Kant does not repudiate and at which he hints when he says that, quote, God as the ideal of perfection is the principle of cognizing, unquote, there is no danger that God's absoluteness will be compromised by confusion between his virtual presence and the local presence of bodies. It remains the case, then, that physical community is an appearance of, and to that extent dependent upon, metaphysical community, which has an absolute ground. We may call this not derivation monism, but dependence monism. As a response to the problems afflicting earlier versions of his pre-critical project, the dissertation is not very satisfactory. Kant avoids any intrusion of the metaphysical into the physical that would transgress the duality demand, but he does so mainly by refraining from saying anything about the mind and its relation to nature. Meanwhile, he attempts to meet the monistic demand by claiming that space, the non-absolute ground of physical community, is derivative from God. The absolute ground of metaphysical community, where this does not mean that space is progressively derivable from God, but rather that, once one knows the structure of both the phenomenal and noumenal worlds, one will realize that the role of space in the former is suggestive of the role of God in the latter. What remains entirely unclear, however, is how we are supposed to know that the intelligible world is a community of substances. Indeed, no warrant is given for this claim beyond the fact that metaphysical community would conveniently undergird physical community. As Kant says, echoing his earlier work, community would not be known from the existence alone of metaphysical substances, which is presumably still to be understood in a roughly Leibnizian fashion, as involving only monadic properties. But if the only justification for Kant's account of the intelligible world consists in a regression from the sensible world, then he can still be accused of allowing the physical to intrude into the metaphysical. In that sense, the duality demand remains unmet.
I love how you finished. Like your tone is very adequate to the philosophical situation that we're facing here. Man, this text is fucking dense.
It is.
I think I'm going to read it again because it's a very nice text.
What are we reading?
All or Nothing, Systematic Transcendental Arguments. Systematicity, Transcendental Arguments, Skepticism, and German Idealism. Harvard University. So anyways, we're only halfway through this chapter, so and we've been going for 2 hours. I think this is a good stopping point, 1.5.
Okay. 2 hours?
Yep.
Wow, it was very entertaining, man.
It doesn't feel like it. Yeah.
Oh wait, Sidis, are you the Brazilian guy?
This is Pedro.
Pedro.
I am the Brazilian guy, Josh.
Yeah. Well, but anyways, hold on.
We have other Brazilians here.
Hold on. What? So, for those of you listening, I hope you enjoyed this. We'll see if we continue this sooner than later. I enjoyed this text. It's very, very informative. And I also enjoy that the author admits to trying to impose a reading on the people he's reading. He's not pretending that this is Leibniz for Kant is Kant. He's trying to put them within a certain framework.
Interesting text.
Yeah, so we'll continue this some other time. For those of you listening, see you next time.